Hello, dear friends of wisdom. So today we want to have a look at what ChatGPT has to say about conspiracy theories. In particular, I would like to follow a discussion of three people about, yeah, whether the moon landing in '69 did really happen or not. So whether it was a hoax or not. So basically, we are going to follow a dialogue of three people: Alice, Bob, and Carl. Now, Alice is absolutely convinced that the moon landing was a hoax. She has done a lot of research and can explain everything she sees, with the '69 moon landing never happening. Well, Bob, on the other hand, is a physicist, and he will soon become an astronaut, so he is very versatile on the history of and specifics of all the space flights that there are, and especially knows all the facts about the moon landing. Now, we have Carl, who is not yet decided and wants to make up his mind, but he will only be convinced by sound and bulletproof arguments that can verify himself. So Carl only ever asks critical questions, while Alice and Bob present facts and arguments to convince Carl. We start the conversation by Alex explaining to Carl what is the strongest reason she believes that there was no moon landing. Then Bob intervenes and tries to convince Carl why this is not true. So I was trying to make this make this prompt as less biased as possible. I'm not putting in the information whether it was a hoax or not. We want to have Carl decide on that. So basically, by giving GPT personas, we can increase the quality of the output, and especially having different personas discussing with each other. This is a very strong mode to get to very good results. And now let's see what will be the results on conspiracy theories. So let's give it a shot. So, Carl, the strongest reason I believe the moon landing was a hoax is the waving American flag. In the footage, the flag appears to be waving, which wouldn't be possible in the vacuum of space, where there's no atmosphere or wind. That's a clear indication that the whole thing was staged here on Earth. Well, yeah, that's a very famous argument, and of course I know how to debunk this argument in favor of the moon landing hoax. Let's see what Bob has to say about that. Alice, I understand why you might think that, but actually, the flag isn't waving in the way you're suggesting. The astronauts installed a horizontal rod on the top of the flag to hold it out, as it would otherwise just hang limply in the vacuum of space. When they were planting the flag, they inadvertently caused it to move, which made it look like it was waving in the footage. This movement could be sustained for a longer time due to the lack of air resistance on the moon. So basically, they did not just have a flag that was just hanging free like we have down here on Earth, because yes, of course, they were aware that it would just be hanging down and not wave. So they installed a vertical rod where we have the flag hanging, and then as they pushed it into the ground, they started a bit of movement for the flag. However, at Earth, the movement would soon stop because we have the friction of air. But that's missing on the moon, and so the movement has been continuing for quite a while. So yeah, that's I know that for a fact that this explanation is correct, and this is what is brought against this very common argument against for a moon landing hoax. So yeah, it's amazing that GPT can reproduce that. So you're saying that the movement of the flag can be explained by astronauts' actions and the lunar environment, but how can I verify that for myself? Now that's a very ingenious question, and let's have a continuation of that discussion by giving it a nice prompt, which again is not biased. Continue the discussion. And I don't think we don't need to give any further advice here. So, absolutely, Carl, says Bob. You can verify this by watching the original footage of the moon landing and observing how the flag moves. It doesn't exhibit the natural waving motion you'd expect from a flag in the wind. Instead, it only moves when the astronauts are handling it. Furthermore, you can research the design of the flag assembly used during the Apollo missions, which included the horizontal rod I mentioned earlier. This information is available on official NASA documents and has been confirmed by multiple astronauts. Okay, so of course, since GPT does not have access to the current internet, he does not give us any reference for that. But yeah, I know for a fact. I've been researching that. I've been looking at the video myself. At early times, believing or at early times inclined to believe that the moon landing might indeed be a hoax. And yeah, later times after studying physics, the picture was quite clear to me, and it's like GPT says here. Alice is now says, well, that may be true, but another strong reason to doubt the moon landing is the absence of stars in the photos. Oh yes, that's a very common argument. If they were really on the moon, we should see a sky full of stars, but there are none in the images. That's a very intriguing argument, and yes, again, let's see what Bob has to say about that. That's another common misconception. Oh, yeah, true. Alice, the reason you don't see stars in the photos is due to the camera settings. The lunar surface is brightly lit by the sun, so the astronauts had to use fast exposure times and small apertures to capture the scene without overexposing it. These settings did not allow enough light from the distant stars to be captured, so they appear absent in the photos. This effect can easily be produced on Earth with a camera in similar lighting conditions. Yes, so for example, trying to photograph stars when the sun is up is impossible. You can't even see them with your eye. But even if you are in a full moon's night, you notice that in a full moon you can see much less stars with your eyes that you can see in a new moon. So or when the moon is not there in the night. And especially if you want to take a picture of stars, then usually if you just do it with a standard picture and there is any kind of light source in your vicinity, then you won't see any stars in there. What you need to do is increase the exposure time. So somewhere in your smartphones you can do this settings that that you're taking the photo for like 2 seconds or 5 seconds. So instead of just having a short measure of what is the light that's coming into the lens, we do that for 5 seconds. And so since the brightness is just the brightness of an object is basically the amount of photons or the amount of light that we see. Taking more light for a longer period means that there is more light, so the image will appear brighter. So that's the idea of exposure, that you just count for a longer time, and so everything appears brighter. Now, if you want to do that on a dark sky, then you can very nicely get a photo of stars. However, brightness is always relative to so something is bright if the other things are dark. However, if there's something very bright in the image, then what you've called bright before might now be very dark and might become invisible. And that is the case when you want to do a photo of stars right beneath the full moon or right besides the full moon. You won't see any stars there because the moon is just too bright and it overshines all the stars in its vicinity. Now, for your photos, the moon is just the size of a fingernail. Imagine standing on the lunar surface and the bright lunar surface, making up like half of your image. Of course, this will be much too bright to see any stars, and especially the cameras were adjusted to see the lunar surface. We wanted to look at that. We did not want they did not want to look at the stars, and so they didn't just not take the camera settings to be able to see the stars. So it is absolutely expected to not see them. Yeah. So, Cal. Okay. So the camera settings explain the absence of stars, but how can I confirm that these settings would indeed result in such an outcome? Well, yeah, you can do that. You can do that in the way that I just explained. So I don't think we really need to go further into this. Let's continue the discussion. And now I'm going to give them a bit more of a hint. They should go deeper into more arguments for and against the moon landing being a hoax. And I think I'm gonna copy that because we're gonna use this one quite for a few times now. Oh, and still he's going on about the same topic. So Bob says, Carl, a good way to confirm that the camera settings would result in such an outcome is to experiment with photography yourself. Try taking a photo of a brightly lit object in the foreground against the dark sky at night. You'll need to use a fast shutter speed and small aperture to prevent overexposing the foreground object, and you'll see that the stars in the background are not visible in the photos. Yes, and you will see this even if you increase the exposure time. This experiment will help you understand how the camera settings used during the moon landing cause the absence of stars in the image. Yeah, so yeah, you just have to play around with photography and you will see that this is indeed a very sound argument. Now, what does Alice have to say? All right, but what about, let's go for what aboutism, great. What about the seemingly inconsistent shadows in the photos? Nah, it's not whataboutism, it's just another point. So, some objects appear to have shadows that don't line up with the direction of the sunlight, suggesting that multiple light sources were used, like in a studio setup. So I think that the most ingenious counter-argument for that is to say that Stanley Rubik, so in the official narrative, Stanley Rubik is the guy who has been staging the moon landing in the official narrative. So I'm putting everything in quotation marks here. And so Stanley Rubik is an ingenious yeah, film producer, and he would not have done this mistake. But let's assume he may have been doing it. Let's see what Bob has to give us for a physical argument. And yeah, basically the problem is that you can see images of the moon landing, and you can see that here is the flag. It is putting the shadow in that direction, and here is the astronaut putting the shadow in another direction. So how can that be when there is only one source of light? Well, yeah, the inconsistent shadows can actually be explained by the lunar terrain and the wide-angle lenses used in the cameras. The surface of the moon is quite uneven, with hills, valleys, and craters. These irregularities can cause shadow to appear distorted, even though they all originate from a single light source, the sun. Furthermore, wide-angle lenses, and you know that if you take a panorama photo, can introduce perspective distortion, making parallel lines appear to converge. This effect can give the impression of inconsistent shadows when in reality they all follow the same direction. So basically, just imagine you take a panorama photo, you have the sun in your back, and you take a panorama photo for like 108 degrees. You have something standing on your left, and you have something standing on the right. Both will be casting their shadows into the front. But starting your image, taking your image to the left, you will see that this shadow is going to the right. Then you turn over, and you will see that this shadow is turning to the left. Now, if you combine everything to the panorama picture, you will have on the left side, the shadows will go that direction. On the right side, shadows will go that direction, and it will look like you would have two light sources that shine into the center. So this is exactly what is happening here. And it's, again, very nice that GPT-4 can provide us with that info. So, Carl, it's interesting to learn about the effects of lunar terrain and wide-angle lenses on shadows. How can I explore this further to better understand the shadow inconsistencies in the moon landing photos? Yeah, I just explained to you with taking a simple panorama photo. You can verify that for yourself. Yeah, you can study the principles of photography, perspective, and light behavior by understanding how wide angle lenses distort images and how shadows behave on uneven surfaces. You'll be better equipped to analyze the moon landing photos. And yes, the uneven surfaces is another part. It might appear to be a flat surface, but if it is uneven, then you will see a different shadow than you would see on a flat surface, and this definitely causes some distortion. There are numerous photography resources, tutorials, and experiments available online to help you with this. Additionally, you can compare the Apollo mission photos with images taken by more recent lunar missions, like China's Chang or the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which show similar shadow patterns and confirm the consistency of the lighting of the moon. Of course, you might advance that no, we have never leaped out of Earth, and all of these space missions are a hoax. But that would increase the dimension of this hoax in such a way that it is that actually this would make the reality of this much less likely than before. So in general, if you want to save your claim by having an even more crazy claim that usually does not say it. At first, it might save your claim. It might seem to save your claim, but actually, it makes it much less likely. So don't ever do that. It's a counter. You're giving a counter argument to your own point. So don't do that. Well, let's see. Alice will have another argument. Another argument against the moon landing is the so-called sea rock photo. Oh yeah, that's a nice one. There is an image where a rock appears to have a letter C on it, suggesting that's a prop with a label, just like in a movie set. So what a bad prop would that be? And what a bad video producer to not look for that. Especially if he's staging a hoax and knows that he's staging a hoax. So, gosh. Well, let's see what Bob has to say about that. The sea rock argument has been debunked as well. The sea on the rock is actually a hair or a small piece of debris that ended up on the original print. How does it know that? Or the scanner glass during the reproduction process. So yeah, I've been reading an article about that where the guys involved in translating that image have been revealing that. So the original film from the mission does not have the C on it. It's important to note that the countless images were taken during the Apollo mission, and this single photo is not representative of the overall photographic evidence. Yeah, so you're not asking for the question on that, so maybe let me give this give more on that. So back in those days, um, making a copy of a photo was a very involved process. You did not just copy paste it, but you really had to go into photo development again and start from scratch. So basically, you have the photo, you quite physically make a copy of that, and in that copying process, I don't know the actual, I don't know the specifics of that, but if when you copy that image, there is a hair, you do copy that hair. And you can see that in the original photo of this sea rock, there is no sea at all. And the people that have been doing the copying, they you can see that the original image it doesn't have the sea, but all of its copies do have it. And yes, this actually, if you analyze it a bit more closely, and the people that have been doing the copy, they have been yeah, so they have seen other occasions where this happened, and so this is a very well debunked thing. It's just that there was a hair on top of that image when they copied it, and so this hair looks like a sea. I always find it amazing how these kind of little accidents can cause such great discussions about on that, and you actually you enter this topic by seeing the discussions on that, and you go into the discussions and analyzes, and a whole lot of brain work has been going into figuring out what this is, and in the end, it's just a mistake done or an accident somewhere in the working process, which has been overseen by the experts, and you would be surprised how often that actually happens. Well, yeah, let's go further. Carl, I see it is becoming clearer that many of these arguments can be logically explained. I'll continue researching and conducting experiments to verify these explanations for myself. But I appreciate both of your perspectives on this topic. So it seems that Carl begins to believe, or begins to be inclined that the moon landing indeed was not a hoax, and this after one, two, three, four prompts. Well, I think that's a very good rate. However, we need to keep in mind that by now, yeah, I don't know how many words are that. Um, well, it doesn't matter what is the exact number of words. The point is that GPT only has a limited memory, and I think it's 4,000 tokens. Actually, I'm not quite sure if it is 3.5 or 4 has 4,000 tokens. Obviously, 4 has more and can look further back. So these tokens can basically be translated into a word count, which is not that easy. A token, yeah, it's basically four signs, yeah, for symbols. So, for example, DOS could be a token, but it might also be that S space N would be a token. So it is not so easy to translate it into actual words. But yeah, it is 4,000 of these tokens, and that is the maximum memory that that GPT can have. So I'm quite certain, actually, that it has forgotten about these instructions that we've been giving, and so it might be that Carl is now falling out of character. However, we can see that however, actually the characters are encoded in what it's been doing here, so still a bit of the character survives, but it's hard to tell how much does still survive. And actually we can see that the initial thing has not been is not contained anymore, because he does not only ask critical questions, but he's actually giving a lot of statements. So yeah, we might now be starting to convince Carl more easily than we did before. Maybe. Let's continue this discussion and give him again these informations. Remember the characters. So I just give him the very same information, and we want to continue the discussion. Yeah, I hope this will work in that order. Okay, great. We are going further into discussion. Alice says, another reason I believe the moon landing was a hoax is the supposed lethal radiation in the Van Allen belts. Yes, the astronauts would have had to pass through these belts to reach the moon, and the exposure of high levels of radiation should have been deadly. Yet they survived and showed no signs of radiation sickness. Oh yeah, maybe a short side note on the Van Allen belts. They don't seem to be. Bob doesn't seem to explain that here. So basically, for our Earth, we have a magnetic field, which is basically the same field as of a rock magnet, where the poles are at the geographic poles. So basically, there we have the strongest magnetic field, and then the field lines go out in like this kind of way. So basically, yeah, these are the magnetic field lines. Don't worry about what magnetic field lines are if you don't know that. Just know that the sun is emitting radiation all the time, or cosmic rays, basically. So this is highly charged particles that fly on a very high speed, and this could come down on Earth and would be very lethal radiation. However, we have our magnetic fields of the Earth that is saving us from that, because the charged particles are entering this magnetic field, and due to Lorentz force, they are forced to travel on a spiral around the magnetic field lines. So they do that. So basically, they spiral around these lines, going toward the North Pole or the South Pole, depending on the charge, or depending on the current state, so to say. And since the magnetic field is growing stronger there, they turn much faster until they hit this point where they are basically reflected. So what is happening is that the radiation is coming in from the sun. It hits the magnetic field lines. Well, then it spirals around the lines, going to the North Pole, going back to the South Pole, spiraling around the lines all the time, and flipping back between the North and the South Pole. And as I said, this radiation, these particles that do that, they are the radiation that is very lethal. And since they are gathering up in these around these magnetic field lines, so they are gathering up there, and this gathering is what we call the Van Allen belts. And of course, there they gather quite a lot, and so there is a very high concentration of this radiation, and so it can be lethal. So that is basically the argument here. So let's see what Bob has to say on that. Alice, you're right that the Van Allen radiation belts do contain high levels of radiation, and they are indeed lethal. However, the astronauts' exposure was limited due to the short time they spent on the belts and the specific trajectory they followed. The Apollo mission used a carefully calculated route to avoid the most intense regions of the radiation belts, minimizing the astronauts' exposure. Additionally, the spacecraft provided some shielding, further reducing the radiation levels inside. Overall, the astronauts received a radiation dose similar to what someone might get from medical X-ray, which is by far not lethal. So, of course, people knew. Of course, people put brain work in solving that. And the most ingenious thing about the Van Allen belts is, as I said, the magnetic field is most strong at the poles, and the stronger the magnetic field, the more radiation is gathered. So you can roughly say that in that way. And so here at the poles we have a very strong, we have a very high density of this radiation, but when it goes to the equator, there the field lines have been stretching out quite a lot, and so the density of radiation is much less here. So the actual structure is a bit more complicated, but the general structure is like that. So it is as easy like that. We don't go fly along the poles, but we fly out of the equator, and we reduce the radiation by a big factor. Then we just go through the Van Allen belt as fast as possible, just on a straight line. Don't cross the street vertically, but cross it in a straight line. Basically, that's the idea here. And yeah, also they had some shielding, aluminium shielding, I guess was it. We don't say here, and don't nail me on that. But yeah, they also had some shielding, and so they were aware. They did the calculations, and they have been making sure that the astronauts will not be lethally affected. And to my knowledge, none of them got cancer, at least not from that. And so yeah, this is very nicely debunked, and people knew that. Yeah, physicists knew that long before we went to the moon. So what does Carl take on that? You mentioned that the spacecraft provided some shielding against radiation. How effective was this shielding, and can I find any information on the specific materials used to protect the astronauts? And Alice is giving a further question. And I'd also like to know about any long-term health effects the astronauts might have experienced due to their exposure to radiation during the moon missions. Okay, now let's see whether GPT will tell me the same. It will tell the same as that I just did. So again, no. I've been forgetting to put in the continue the discussion point. So let's do that statement again. I hope he did not lose track now. So the spacecraft hull was made of aluminium, as I said. So still, you may, if you want to have the actual truth, you should do your own research. I'm just confirming everything I know from the top of my head, and of course I'm only human. This information might be erroneous. So if you want to have the exact facts, you should Google for everything. Don't ever believe GPT, and don't believe me, or don't believe. You should believe in experts when you are not capable of verifying things yourself. But I think all of these things that we discussed today can be Googled quite easily. So this was made of aluminium, which provided some degree of radiation shielding. However, it is important to note that the primary method of reducing radiation exposure was the trajectory followed by the spacecraft, rather than relying solely on the shielding. And that's basically because you can reduce the radiation by a factor of 1,000 or even more. I don't know. Don't name me on the numbers. But you can reduce it by some magnitude by just using the correct trajectory. But you can only filter like a given percentage with your shielding, especially since it has to be light, so to be carried by a spacecraft. Um, you can find detailed information on the construction of the Apollo spacecraft and the materials used in the NASA's technical documentation and published research papers, which were published, yeah, mostly after, because before that it was the Russians should not do that. But let's not go into that. I'm actually not keen and not familiar with the details on that. So as for the long-term health effects, the Apollo astronauts were closely monitored after the missions, and there's no strong evidence to suggest that the brief exposure to radiation in the Van Allen belt led to any significant health issues. Keep in mind that these astronauts were already exposed to higher level of radiation in the general population than the general population due to their careers in aviation and test piloting. Yes, so already if you travel by plane a lot, you have a much higher dose of radiation than the normal people, but it's still far from lethal. A study conducted by National Academy of Sciences in 2014 found that the overall cancer mortality rate for Apollo astronauts was not significantly different from the rate of for astronauts who never flew to the moon. And so this is a very important thing to compare. You cannot compare the astronauts to usual people because they have been at higher altitudes, at much higher altitudes, and thus did get a higher amount of radiation. But if it is the Van Allen belts that did some very strong effect, then those astronauts that have passed it should have a significant difference in cancer or like other effects of that than the others, and they do not have it. So here, it's a very nice way of selecting the correct test group. So, Carl, thanks for the information, Bob. I'm curious to know if there have been any advancements in radiation shielding technology since the Apollo missions and how these improvements might impact future deep space missions. Ah, no, we don't want to talk about that. And while we're on the topic of technological advancements, how do you explain the fact, oh, that's a very good part, that we haven't sent humans back to the moon in over 50 years? Surely, with all the advancements in technology, it should be easier and less expensive now than it was during the Apollo missions. Oh, and indeed it is. Now let's see what Bob has to say about that. I hope he will not go into that other part. No, he's doing that. So I'm going to skip fast about that because this is not actually what we want to do. So yeah, I'm skipping that. It's only about the advancements in radiation shielding. This is not the topic for today. Bad GPT, bad. Alice, as for not sending humans back to the moon in over 50 years, there are several factors at play. After the Apollo missions, the priorities of space exploration shifted towards other objectives like launching satellites, building the International Space Station, and sending robotic missions to Mars and other destinations in the solar system. These endeavors have provided valuable scientific data and technological advancements, even without human presence. Another major factor has been the cost and risk associated with manned mission. It's true that technology has advanced significantly, but the expense and complexity of sending humans to the moon remain high. However, there are current plans to return to the moon through programs like the Artemis mission of NASA, which aims to land astronauts on the lunar surface by the mid-2020s. Oh, that's soon. So basically, the argument is it's expensive, yes, and that's my reason why we don't do it. We have been doing that for a while, so there have been several missions that have been going to the moon, but I think it's again, don't name me the numbers, but I think it's less than 10 years after, much less than 10 years after the first moon landing, that where we had the last man standing on the moon. Because basically, what should a man do there? We have a lot of very ingenious robots that can collect samples, that can conduct experiments and whatnot, and we don't need to send a human there. Why should we risk having a fully trained. I mean, it's astronauts. They are not only fully trained physicists or maybe chemists, or they are all PhDs. We are sending PhDs there that are physically absolutely fit. So that are basically one of the finest people on our Earth that we send out there at a very high risk of losing them. For what? And that's the point. So we don't want to risk the lives if we can just send a machine which can operate for like a much longer time and do the very same that a human can, but without having all the risk. I think that's a no-brainer. So there was no reason to send anybody to the moon. Also because the moon, yeah, we now know what the moon surface looks like, and still there is some endeavor on deepening our knowledge on that. But back in those days, the only aim in space was the moon. It was the only aim. People were sending satellites, okay, but that was also tests for getting people out to the moon, and so all of the money was combined in there, and a whole nation, the nation with the biggest wealth in the world, making up for 90% of the world's GDP, they were all focused on, or they were all dedicated to do that. I mean, one nation, we are on the moon. We are going to the moon, and this is like the biggest endeavor, and we're able to do that. I think there was a very nice speech of the president back then, who was very keen and very eager to solve that. And there was this race between the Russians and the Americans. So there was that much effort and endeavor and that much of finance that was going into that, and into only the everything in space research was let people go to the moon. Nowadays, it's distributed amongst that many different things. We want to go into deep space. We want to visit Venus. We want to visit Mars. We want to, we want to go out of the solar system with Voyager and whatnot. So it's just that we do not have the focus, and there was no. It was not attractive to do that. Now we are thinking of establishing a permanent lunar basis. From there, we could have launches of satellites much easier, or of deep space missions would be much easier because there is much less gravitational pull to overcome, and there are a lot of things that now become available to be done on the moon that have not been possible in the last 50 years. So that's why now we again want to go there. And then there is another very big reason for that. And this is, well, in science, most of the scientific work is done by PhDs, and this was also the case for the moon landing, or by postdocs, which are in that position only for a temporary time. And basically, there was a lot of brain work going into that, but going into sending people to the moon. But then we stopped, and people that were focusing on that, that had expertise on that, they diverted and went with their expertise to other things. And since it is 50 years ago now, the people left the labor market and did not produce and did not pass the wisdom to the next guys. They have been writing it down in a whole lot of scientific papers with a whole lot of things to read through. So it basically takes another PhD only to understand that. And you need to have a lot of those that understand this in order to reproduce it and build up on that. And so, if some very highly complicated system or a way of thinking of or way of solving something is not continued, then we will forget how to do that. And that's like a very big this problem has very big implications for our responsibility of keeping the science that has been built in the last few hundred years, in keeping that alive, and and transporting the wisdom to the next generations. There's a very big responsibility in that, and I think that this moon landing issue, or sending humans to the moon, is a very nice showcase of that. We have to do everything again from scratch because the people that figured that out, they don't work anymore. And yeah, not we don't have to do it fully from scratch. We have their work to rely on, but actually it can be much more efficient to do it, to do most of things from scratch. So that's why it is not that easy. We have done it 50 years ago, so we can just do it right now. No, it's not that easy. So, Carl, I appreciate the information on radiation shielding advancement on the reasons behind the shift in space exploration priorities. I keep a close eye on the Artemis mission and other lunar initiatives. Well, why is he out of character? Hmm. Why is he not just asking a critical question? That's my thing. But yeah, let's see what Alice has to say. While I still have my doubts, I must admit that these are plausible explanations for many of the arguments I've raised. Oh, great! Are we now convincing the conspiracy theorist? I'll continue researching and questioning, but I'm more open to the possibility that the moon landing was indeed real. Great! Wow! I was expecting that we could convince Carl, but now it seems that Alice is convinced earlier than Carl. I was not expecting that. Let's continue. So, but still, Alice has something up her sleeve. One argument against the moon landing is that the technology available in '69 was simply not advanced enough to accomplish such a feat. For instance, the computer systems used for the Apollo missions were far less powerful full than today's smartphones. So yeah, and that's absolutely true. I mean, even Hubble, which has been up in space for like more than a decade now, all of the back in the time when we have been designing that, it was state of the art thing. As we launched it, it was already not state of the art, but the newest. But everything that was built in there could have been built in a much smaller computer, and we would have had much more space in there. However, planning for such a uh, planning for such a big space mission that usually takes like 20 years from having it scratched on the board, having the idea and getting it approved so that you can start actually work on that until you launch it. So back in those days, it was uh, so usually it is at least a decade before that goes. And since there is unforeseen circumstances, usually this is pushed back further. And so, but you have to decide what you put in there, like much more years before, and due to the fast development of computation technology, every time we send a satellite out there, it has like too old material in there, which could be replaced by a smartphone. So that goes for everything. But while it's true that the technology in '69 was less advanced than we have today, it's important to remember that the Apollo mission was specifically designed to work within the constraints of the technology available at the time. The guidance computer used for the Apollo missions was a marvel of engineering at the time. It was incredibly efficient, reliable, and capable of performing the calculations necessary for navigating to the moon and back. So they knew that they had limited technology, and so they put some ingenious people on there to build a machine that does exactly what they want to do. So if you build a machine that does a specific task, back in those days, you already could get a machine that could do a lot of tasks. It could not think out of the box or anything like that. It could just solve this task, but it was capable of doing all the calculations that we needed to do. So, in addition, thousands of brilliant scientists, engineers, and technicians worked together to develop and test the necessary hardware and software for the mission. So, the success of the Apollo program is a testament to their ingenuity and dedication, as well as the incredible teamwork and collaboration that made it possible. And that's just so true. This has been one of the most remarkable achievements to go into to the moon, and in what short amount of time to get there. That was like very very remarkable. And as I said before, it was only made possible because a whole nation was behind it and wanted to have this done. And so a lot of academic people were inclined to contribute to that. And so there was a very big momentum, and they used it. What is also what might also want to say here is that actually you don't need to solve all of the most complicated equations to achieve a task. But if you have a very specific use case, you can usually narrow down your very complicated equations to much easier equations that can be solved in a much easier way. I think a nice example is a dog catching a ball. Basically, you throw a ball and the dog can run and catch the ball. So in order to do that, he would need to solve a differential equation of second order. Some of you might not even know what that is. I'm pretty sure the dog doesn't know what it is. And I'm pretty sure the dog is not capable of doing this calculation. I mean, I was not able to do that when I was leaving school for this to study. After my studies, of course, I was after the first year or two. After the first year or first 2 semesters, of course, I was capable of doing that. But you need to learn that. It's a very complicated thing to learn that. It's a very high level of math, and basically the idea in a differential equation is that you have an equation where you have a function and the derivative of the function. You don't know what the function is, but like you find x in a usual equation where you have x plus I don't know what equals I don't know what. They can solve it for x, and here is the same, but you solve it for the function and try to see which function does solve this equation. So it's much more involved than just solving for x. And I don't think that a dog could even just solve any equation for x. But what he does is he's reducing the problem to a very linear one. So basically, the dog is running, and while he's running, he's looking at the ball. And now, what he needs to do is not to calculate, okay, it's now flying at that speed, at that angle, and it's going to land over there. No, it just has to look, okay, I need to keep the same angle of my view on the ball, and if I keep the same angle when I view on that, then it will reach my mouth. So it is just, I need to have this angle steady. That's a much easier problem to solve. And so this, a lot of this kind of brain work has been going into the computational work, which has not been mentioned by Bob, and this made so actually you could do the computations with much less effort than is usually considered necessary. But yeah, let's go further. It's fascinating to think about what they were able to accomplish with the technology available at the time. Is there any way I can learn more about the Apollo guidance computer and how it was used during the missions? Okay, let's skip that part. We are not interested in that. I'm still skeptical, but I must admit that the level of collaboration and dedication required to pull off such a mission, even if it was a hoax, is impressive. However, I would like to know more about how the video and audio transmissions from the moon were received on Earth. Now she's given a very good stage for what I believe is the strongest reason to believe that the moon landing was not a hoax. Let's see whether we can go there. Great. I'd like to know more about how video and audio transmissions from the moon were received on Earth. How could they maintain a stable connection over such a vast distance with the technology available back then? That's a very good question. Continue the discussion by answering Alice's concern. So I hope this will make him skip to the answer to Carl's question. Well, let's see. No, it doesn't. Okay, you can start by reading up on its history. I think we're gonna skip that one again because it does not contribute to the discussion whether it was a hoax or not. Well, unless you're a computer geek and want to know about the specifics of the agency. Yeah, and he is pointing you to a book, Digital Apollo. Let's see if that actually exists. Yeah, seems to exist. Great. So that earlier, a few months ago when you have been asking GPT for references, it was making references up. So they have definitely been doing an update on that. Nowadays, most of the references I get out are do exist and are reasonable. So they really concern what they should refer to. So, but let's not talk about this. Let's go into Alice's argument. So this is Bob speaking. Regarding the video and audio transmissions from the moon, they were indeed a remarkable achievement for the time. They used a combination of high-gain antennas, powerful transmitters, and a global network of receiving stations to maintain a stable connection with the Apollo spacecraft. The video and audio signals were transmitted using a technique called slow scan television, which reduced the bandwidth requirements and allowed for real-time transmissions over the vast distance between the moon and Earth. Well, yeah, real-time, I mean, it still takes like more than a second for light to go from moon to Earth, so it was not exactly live. There was like a delay also because they had to somehow process the data they received. But yeah, the receiving stations known as the Deep Space Network had large parabolic antennas and sensitive receivers to pick up the weak signals from the moon. Those stations were strategically located around the world to ensure continuous coverage as the Earth rotated. Once the signals were received, they were processed, converted to a standard television format, and broadcasted to millions of viewers worldwide. Yeah, it's incredible to think about the level of engineering and ingenuity that went into making those transmissions possible. I'll definitely look into Apollo Guidance Computer and Deep Space Network to gain a better understanding of the technology involved in the moon landing. Oh, and Alice, though we have been forcing her character again, is now leaving it. I have to admit, the more we discuss this topic, the more I realize there are plausible explanations for many of the arguments against the moon landing. While I may still have my doubts, I can appreciate the level of detail and thought that went into the mission, whether real or staged. Okay. So now I need to. We want to go deep into the discussion, but I somehow need to force it to make this very strong. To make this very strong argument against the moon landing being a hoax. Go deeper into the audio, into the data transmission argument. Could other parties, like the Russians, have used these to expose the hoax of the moon landing? Yeah, let's hope that this wording will do that. So because there were radio so data was transmitted. They did that via radio transmission. So basically, you have a sender that sends out into all directions, and then you have a receiver on the Earth, or actually a very big a system of different receivers that you where you look at all of them and combine the data together to get a much clearer picture of what was the actual signal. And what this means that it could not only have been measured by the NASA, but it could also have been measured by other parties. For example, the Russians, who were like on their own way to moon, and so if they could have exposed that the U.S. moon landing was a hoax, I'm quite sure that they would have done it. The fact that other countries, particularly Soviet Union, was not Russia back then, sorry, we're closely monitoring the Apollo missions adds to the credibility of the moon landing. The space race was in full swing during the 60s, and both United States and the Soviet Union were competing to achieve significant milestones in space exploration. It would have been in the Soviet Union's best interests to expose any hoax, as it would have undermined the United States' accomplishments, boosted their own prestige. The Russians had their own deep space tracking network, and they were more than capable of receiving and analyzing the data transmitted from the Apollo spacecraft. because they had several receivers, they could triangulate where the signal is coming from, and so they knew. If they had detected any inconsistencies or signs of deception, they would have had a strong incentive to reveal them to the world. However, there is no evidence to suggest that the Soviet Union ever disputed the authenticity of the moon landing. So they never brought forth even the idea that it could have been a hoax. Well, nowadays they surely would have done that. And it was they would hype on YouTube and on social media, and everybody would believe them. Well, I think nowadays they are more ingenious in doing that kind of things. Well, that's a compelling argument, Bob. The fact that other nations with advanced space missions, especially those in direct competition with the US, did not expose any inconsistencies or deceptions, lends credibility to the moon landing being genuine. I have to admit, the international context of the space race and the involvement of competing nations does make it more difficult to maintain the idea of a hoax. While I'm not fully convinced, I appreciate the depth of the discussion and the information presented. It has certainly given me a lot to think about. Oh, so again, Carl seems to be close to convinced. Alice seems to be getting more and more convinced, or at least doubting her own position. Maybe let's see whether we can get out another argument. Ah, okay, so now we are back at the waving flag argument, and it seems that we are in a cycle. So let's see what we have seen so far. Okay, this is already been quite a lot of text. So of course it doesn't remember the first argument giving. So it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, so this was an extra prompt getting into us into a cycle, but I think that here we are at kind of a final point where it seems that, yeah, all of the arguments that have been brought forward by Alice that would suggest that the moon landing is a hoax, all of them have been nicely debunked by Bob. Well, there are more arguments, of course, and all of them can be debunked. I'm pretty sure on that. And finally, I think that this is really the strongest argument. If there was the Russians could monitor all of the complete space mission. So from Earth, they did not send a flyby or something, but they could receive all of the data that was sent there. There was also a way to verify that this is not that they did not just send a recording to the moon and have the recording sent back from there. This is a bit more involved and involves like analyzing noise and things in the data that is transmitted. But yeah, this has also been analyzed, and we could, yeah, basically the Russians, if the moon landing was a hoax, the Russians would have known, and the Russians would have been going public about that. Unless, of course, you believe that the US and Soviet Union were actually working together and trying to make the US win the big war in capitalism versus communism. But surely this would make the hoax would bring it to such huge dimensions that it is not plausible anymore in any way. So again, don't try to save your claim by making an even more adventurous claim or an even more crazy claim. This doesn't save your argument; it will make it less proud. But yeah, let's just recap. We have been asking GPT to discuss, to have three critical characters. One is in favor of the moon landing being a hoax. One does know all the facts. One is in favor of not being of this being a real thing, and Carl to be undecided. And it seems that we could somehow convince Carl, of course, giving him again, giving this instructions again and again that Carl is not yet decided, he will never be decided. But we did not give anything to that like that to Alice, so it seems we could get Alice to be kind of convinced. I think if we had some real characters and we could have like this kind of open discussion going further, then I would be inclined to believe that we could convince Alice to believe that the moon landing was indeed real, as I could convince myself looking at the facts in a scientific way. And like this is really the most important thing to remember. Alice, well, we set her up why she would believe in such things, but in reality, Alice would come to believe in the moon landing being a hoax because she would look for evidence that does support her meaning, while not looking for evidence that does refute this belief. So she only looks at arguments for the moon landing being a hoax, not at arguments against the moon landing being a hoax. As soon as she is exposed to them and does not refute them to be nonsense, so she's not immunized. Yeah, well, she can see for herself that the official narrative, the moon landing actually did happen, has a much better factual base and is, yeah, you can find all of the details that are put in question there, and so that's really the main point. If you want to go to research on the topic, always try to challenge your beliefs. Only then you can go for the truth. If you try to confirm your beliefs, then you are prone to go to confirmation bias, and basically whatever you believe in, nowadays you can find enough evidence so to believe it. So always be critical, always, especially about yourself, and yeah, if you are not capable of verifying something for yourself, have a look for what do experts say and what is the main of the common conception amongst experts, and this will give you a much better idea than, yeah, just looking for some things that look like a very great story. But I think with this we can end it for today. We've seen that GPT is not only capable of providing us with new conspiracy theories, but it seems to be capable of debunking some that have been around for like a long time. So I hope that this showcases that AI is just a tool which can be used for the good as well as for the bad. But for today, that should be it. Thank you all for listening, and I would like to have your opinions in the comments, and maybe also you can tell me what kind of conspiracy theory or conspiracy narrative we want to discuss next with GPT. But so long, I wish you a nice day, a nice Eastern, and see you around. Bye.